Story 1. My grandma did not drive. I thought she couldn't, but it was just never discussed. One day, when I was maybe 7 or 8, I've been trying to get anyone to drive me to the store for candy. We were visiting my aunt and uncle, and grandma lived with them. They had Bit of Honey at the local store, which I could no longer get at home. But no one would take me to the store. Finally, I just said, "Come on, Grandma." And my cousins chimed in with, "Grandma can't drive." And that's when Grandma says, "Oh, you bet your sweet butt I can drive. They just don't let me." Grandma had overheard and she was in high dudgeon. But that's all that was said about it, and my aunt finally took me to the store, so I forgot about it. Years later, when I just gotten my license, I asked my mom what was up with Grandma not driving. She explained that during Prohibition, Grandma bootlegged alcohol for moonshiners. She was very successful at it, and she was so successful at it that when the moonshiners were finally busted, even though the revenuers never caught my grandma, her license was suspended indefinitely by the state to never be reissued. Later in life, she was told she could petition for it back, but it came with an admission of guilt or something. She told them to go to heck. Story 2. I started having problems with my teeth. Spontaneous abscess that resulted in multiple root canals. My dentist did some looking into what the cause might be and found some really odd abnormalities. And especially with my incisors, roots, and nerves. The teeth that had been afflicting me. So, he sent out requests for help to a couple of professors he knew in the field. When my next appointment came up, he was really quiet for a bit, before verbally stumbling about. It turns out that what was happening with my teeth was a classic case of inbreeding. And he was super uncomfortable giving me the news. I brought it up to my mom, and she was just like, "Oh yeah, well, yeah, didn't you know?" What? Of course I didn't know. Turns out that not very far back in the family tree, several of the relatives decided that it was a good idea to get married to one another, and no one bothered to mention it ever. The small town where I lived is 85% my relatives, and that is no joke. I haven't even met all of them. That's how many there are. And a quick edit for clarification, I've made a big point of going far away from my hometown to meet my husband, married 12 years this June, because I was afraid of having children with someone that might be my cousin. Only to find out 5 years after we've been married that I was in fact a product of inbreeding. My husband and I are not related at all. Story 3. Okay, buckle up. I've recounted this story before, and well, this one is crazy. Dad got a girl pregnant and she decided to go it alone. She moved across the states and had my half-sister. She met a guy, got married, and he raised her like she was his own. They had no other children. She did not reveal my dad's identity until after he died. Apparently, she contacted my grandma and my mom, but they kept it from us. Years later, half-sister has a kid with medical issues and needs to know family medical history. She contacts mom and grandma, who again don't tell us. Meanwhile, after dad died, my uncle had prints made of a favorite picture of father. He gets them framed and gives them to all of us kids, as well as my grandma, aunts, and uncles. Mom gets a picture to our half-sister after their secret meeting. Fast forward another few years. My brother and his roommate live in a nearby large city and hit a bar, and they pick up and bring home some ladies to, quote, sleep over. The next morning, my half-sister sees a photo of my dad on the mantle, turns white, and asks, whose picture is that?" "That's my roommate's dad. He died a long time ago." "I need to talk to your roommate." She lived her entire life across the state, hundreds of miles. Her friend was going to school in a large city near our hometown. She was visiting and they decided to go to the bar. They get picked up by my brother and his roommate. That's how we found out. My brother went to my grandma and asked about her, and grandma first denied it, then gave in and spilled the beans. What a small world. Story number 4. My mother had a child when she was a teenager, and she had given him up for adoption to a family. After this, she went to college, got her degree, married my father, and gave birth to my 4 siblings and myself. 30 years after giving her child up for adoption, I remember her getting a phone call and immediately locking herself in her room. I was about 12 years old at the time. I remember feeling scared because I could hear my mom crying. But she didn't want to see anybody or talk about what she was even crying about. On an evening later that week, my parents sat each of us kids down and told us about Mom's past and explained that my half-brother had reached out to my mom wanting to meet her and get to know her. My dad had known ever since he and Mom were dating in college, and I believe my oldest sister had been told previous to this point. But the rest of my siblings, and myself included, and all of the in-laws on my father's side, my grandma, aunts, and uncles, etc., did not know about this part of her past. We're fairly religious/conservative, so it was really shocking at first. Well, my mom then flew out to the state where my half-brother lived with her sister and met him. Both my mom and my half-brother were both very nervous about the whole thing. But by the end of their trip, meeting each other, they got to rebuild a relationship. After a bit of time, we, my siblings and I, got to meet him too. Well, let's fast forward now. He's since moved to our same state and we see him much more frequently. He's in all our family pictures and we see him occasionally for holidays and birthdays and whatnot. And we all see him as part of our family. We're a very close-knit and extroverted family while he is much more shy, so at times it can be a bit more distant than we would like, but we gave him his space, and I know my mom stays in close touch with him, and we love it when he's able to make family dinners and whatnot. Back then, I was the youngest, and up till then, the only boy in the family. So, I love learning that I had an older brother. Now that I'm an adult, I sometimes get his old clothes because we're roughly the same size. He's got good taste too, so I really lucked out. I love that this family secret was spilled and that we were able to welcome my brother into our family and have him in our lives. Story number 5. When I was 28, I found out that my dad was not my biological father. The news came out via the following. My dad was battling depression and, well, he wanted to hurt himself, so I just flown home to take care of him and rescue him from my mom's wrath. My mom had verbally and emotionally abused him during their entire relationship. He loved her so much and he tolerated it. Well, during a walk with my father, as I tried to help him out, he confided that he's not my real father. And he went on to tell me he knew this all along, but my mom lied to him and tried to convince him that he was my biological father. He knew he wasn't, but he wanted to play the role. When I was 10 years old, my mom finally confessed this to him, and he was worried that upon hearing the news officially, he'd somehow let it affect his relationship with me. So, when I was 20 years old, during this walk with my dad, as he pours this story out to me, he frames it by telling me that his 2 most proud items in life are number 1, how I turned out and him raising me, and number 2, that he had completely forgot about the news my mom told him earlier in that day, when I was 10, about him not being my biological father, and that it was only upon tucking me in that night when I was 10 years old that it briefly crossed his mind. It was at that point that he knew nothing would ever come between us, and our father-son relationship would be as awesome as ever. He also confided that my mom did hard drugs while pregnant with me, and this broke his heart to witness firsthand. They were very poor. My dad grew up in a foster home without parents, and my mom grew up with 6 siblings and ill-equipped parents. She dropped out of the 9th grade, whereas all of her other siblings dropped out earlier. Many of them are barely literate. I'm now in my mid-30s, and tragically, my dad, well, he died mid-March 2020. Yeah, he did it to himself. Right as COVID was hitting. I was out of the country at the time, but immediately flew 30 hours with a 30-minute layover and made it in time for his funeral. Now I do everything in his honor. Story number 6. My uncle served in Vietnam. While over there, his troop found a baby that had been orphaned or abandoned, and they aren't sure. My uncle was shipping back to Australia soon and wanted to adopt him. But my aunt said no. They've only been married about 4 months when he was drafted, so while I don't agree with my aunt's actions, and generally don't like her as a person, I can understand why she said no. My uncle's troop found out, and, well, they found a family to raise the baby. And that's the story the whole family knows. The secret is that my uncle and some other guys from his troop stayed in contact with the family and the kid, sending them money every month to help raise him and then to help him go to university, and eventually help him and his adoptive family move to Australia in the late 90s. My aunt and the rest of the family had absolutely no idea at the time. It only came out when my aunt and uncle divorced in 2017. And she had a forensic accountant go through their bank records. She worked at a bank for like 40 years and always noticed the money missing, but his reasons seemed always to be justified and answered. Well, since we all now know, my uncle has introduced some of us to the guy and his family, and they're all really lovely people. Edit to clarify as to why my aunt is a bad person in this instance. Sorry guys, I was half asleep when I posted this, and I realized I left out a pretty important detail to explain why I don't like my aunt for this facepalm. To preface, I'm child-free, and if my husband was in this situation, I'd say no as well. It's not the fact that she said no to adopting the kid that makes me dislike her for this, it's her reason. Aunt is a very racist person against Asian people. Doesn't matter what part of Asia, she hates them. She's the kind of person who will yell, "Go back to your darn country," at random strangers who even vaguely look like they may have Asian ancestry. She also cut contact with my cousin, her daughter, because my cousin's husband is half Japanese. She said in front of my family with no shame that if the kid was not Asian, she would have said yes to adopting him without thinking twice. Story 7. I grew up in a Mexican family and have 2 younger cousins. My aunt married another Latino guy who basically looked white. The oldest child was a girl and came out looking exactly like her father, full stop. The second was a boy and came out looking like me, his mom. Maybe. He was dark like I'm half black and this kid is darker than me. But his mom was pretty brown as well, so we thought nothing of it. Kid looks like his mom. Well, fast forward 16 years later. They divorced and hate each other, and the daughter was always treated like a princess. The boy was rather spoiled too, but very much sought out his dad's approval, which he just was not getting. He could not figure out why, and he's acting out, getting in trouble, running with gangs. Boo-hoos about his dad all the time. Well, Dad had enough and flat out told him, "You're not my kid. Your mom, she likes to hook up, and I don't know who your dad is, kid." He even was kind enough to offer up a paternity test. His mother never said crap about it, she just took the ignore it approach and hoped it went away. We now know his dad was a Pacific Islander, and while there is one who has always been a family friend for many years, he took the paternity test too and was completely cleared. So the mystery remains on who she cheated on her ex with. She says she doesn't even know. Story 8. My father died, I was 17. At the funeral home during a viewing, a young lady and her boyfriend show up. She was probably 2 or 3 years older than me. Nobody recognized her, so she was asked why she was there. She stated that she was there to see her father. My siblings and I are naturally confused, and our mom's just standing there shaking her head. My uncles ask her to leave, and she leaves crying in her boyfriend's arms. Our mother takes us to a private area and explains our father had an affair years ago, and that was our stepsister. I never heard any more about her, never learned her name, have never met her. I would like to meet her and apologize for my family. Seeing her rejected and crying because she could not even attend a viewing for her dead father bothers me to this day. And well, this was over 40 years ago.